I would like to start with the latest news about the creation of the Ministry of Information in Ukraine. Do you think it is a threat to human rights, to the right to freedom of speech?
Well, it could be. I think we have to see how it plays out. I understand the government is setting it up because it wants to counter Russian propaganda. But I think we all know that the best way to fight propaganda is not with more propaganda, it's with honesty. And so I hope that the government recognizes that it should be opening up the East. It should be welcoming journalists to go there to write about what's actually happening. Because the more the government tries to cover up, the more it's going to have a hard time distinguishing itself from the Russia propaganda that everybody has learned to distrust. So we're going to have to look very carefully, are there restrictions put on journalists? For a moment there were, then they were taken away. I hope that the government has learned from that little debacle to not try to restrict journalists, but rather to try to facilitate their access to whatever can be found in the East.
What are your other concerns in the field of human rights in Ukraine? What were you talking about with Ukrainian officials?
Well, Human Rights Watch in any armed conflict situation always reports on both sides. And so over the last several months, we've actually put out 23 different publications about abuses by the separatists, by the rebels. We also put out a major report on the Russian occupation of Crimea and the abuses that the Crimean Tatars are facing, or people who don't want to adopt Russian citizenship. But at the same time, we've been looking at the behavior of the pro-government forces. And that's been a major topic of our conversations here in Kiev with government officials from a range of different ministries. What we're most concerned about is that pro-government forces have been using certain indiscriminate weapons, grad rockets, cluster munitions, in populated areas. Now, the good news is that the government agrees with us that that should never happen. That these kind of indiscriminate weapons violate the Geneva Conventions when used in populated areas. So the real question is, how does that message get to the troops on the ground? Because they haven't heard it yet, according to the research of Human Rights Watch done in the East, looking at the physical evidence of the use of these weapons. And so we've been pushing the government to be much more specific about the instructions that it gives its troops. Not simply to say, respect the Geneva Conventions, which sounds great but doesn't mean anything to the troops on the ground. Rather, we want them to be quite explicit. Never use grad rockets, never use cluster munitions in populated areas, even if the other side is shooting at you. Because what we find often is that the rebels are firing from the cities. They, in themselves, are violating the Geneva Conventions because they are endangering the civilian population, possibly even using them as human shields. But we all know that under the Geneva Conventions, a violation by one side never justifies a violation by the other side. And so we have to get that message clearly conveyed to the troops on the ground. Similarly, the fact that one side may be an aggressor doesn't allow the other side to ignore the Geneva Conventions. The fact that Russia is backing the rebels in the East doesn't allow pro-Ukrainian forces to simply ignore the basic rules designed to spare civilians as much as possible the hazards of warfare.
What has been the reaction of Ukrainian officials to your reports and to your concerns? Do they recognize that there are violations of human rights such as you listed? Because in his recent interview, President Poroshenko denied that Ukrainian army is using cluster munitions, and again today the Security Council of Ukraine denied this fact again. So did you see any response from the Ukrainian authorities, any recognition of the human rights violation you mentioned?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that President Poroshenko has chosen to deny what the very clear physical evidence on the ground absolutely confirms. If he were to go there and even look at the evidence, he'd be convinced in 2 seconds. He's chosen instead, I suppose, to go the route of the Russian propagandists and just deny. We hope he'll change his mind on that, because when we've spoken to the Defense Ministry and others, they all admit that they have many, many cluster munitions. They agree with us that they shouldn't be used. We talked to the military prosecutor and said, did you investigate these cases? And he said he did. But then when you probe him a little bit to see what kind of investigation, it turns out that when it comes to the grad missile, the grad rocket attacks on populated areas, he basically just asked the commanders and looked at the written orders and said, did you use these weapons? And they all said, no, of course not. I mean, he didn't even bother going and looking at the physical evidence. When it comes to the cluster munitions, he went to the government arsenals, which are filled with cluster munitions, and said, aha, nobody took anything out of this arsenal on the relevant day. The problem is he didn't even look at the right weapon. He was looking at anti-personnel mines, not the cluster munitions that were actually used. So these are not serious efforts to get to the truth. If you go to the ground, you see that, first of all, the distinctive pattern of cluster munitions is on the ground. It's absolutely clear that these were used. You can tell both from the point of contact, you can tell where they were shot from, and then when you go over and look to the area that the missiles clearly came from, in some cases the missiles sort of misfired and didn't get very far, and they landed very near where they were shot. All of this in government-held territory. So it's absolutely clear, if anybody does a serious investigation, that the government did use this. And I hope that President Poroshenko on down moves past the blanket denial phase, which is just not credible, and begins to try to solve the problem. Acknowledge that it happened and give clear orders to the troops for this never to happen again. That's how Ukraine will maintain the moral high ground. Because around the world, there's enormous goodwill that exists for the people of Ukraine because of the conduct of Russia. And that will be lost if Ukrainian forces start ignoring the Geneva Conventions. They should never be using cluster munitions. They should never be using Grad rockets in populated areas. That message should be conveyed not simply by the Defense Ministry, but by the President himself. So rather than deny, I hope he takes the high moral ground and insists that these kind of violations of the Geneva Convention not recur, that they not happen again.
Has there been any reaction from the Russian side, from the Russian authorities, to the accusations of violations of human rights in the occupied Crimea?
The Russian authorities love when we talk about violations by Ukrainian forces, and then they turn into big deniers when we talk about violations by their own forces. Now, they have this view that everybody in Crimea was dying to be a Russian citizen, and that's the end of the story. Of course, that's not true. We all know that. They're the Crimean Tatars. There are various critics of the Russians. There are various people who, for a variety of personal reasons, are not eager to be Russian citizens. And now suddenly what they're finding is that if they don't adopt Russian citizenship, they may lose the legal right to live in the territory that they've lived their entire lives in. They suddenly are denied effective citizenship rights. That's a clear violation, in this case, of the right of people living under belligerent occupation, the Fourth Geneva Convention, because it's absolutely clear that Russia is the occupying power in Crimea and has a duty not to treat the people of Crimea the way it has been. Now, I'm about to go to Moscow, having completed my talks here in Kiev, and this is one of the issues that I'm going to be raising in my conversations with the Russian government, to push them to stop this effective blackmail on the people of Crimea, to force them or to pressure them to assume Russian citizenship.
There have been some concerns about the reports of human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch being manipulated by Russia, by Russian propaganda. I'm referring in particular to the report on the cluster munitions that has been used, really manipulated by the Russian Foreign Ministry. How do you address these concerns, and how do you try to somehow avoid being manipulated by the Russian side in this case?
The Russians had nothing to do with our investigation. Human Rights Watch is a completely independent organization. We don't take funding from any government, particularly the Russian government, but no government at all. We operate completely independently. We go into the field. We look for witnesses to violations. We look for victims. We look at the physical evidence. We do this on our own. Our own people are there. The Russian Foreign Ministry, the Russian government had nothing to do with it. They didn't know what we were going to find until we published the report, and they learned about it at the same time you learned about it. So the idea of blaming Russian propaganda is a cheap trick. I mean, that's not what was going on here. This is what happened on the ground. And I hope that the Ukrainian government doesn't fall back on these cheap arguments that somehow this is Russian propaganda behind it, somehow Human Rights Watch was manipulated. No way, they were not even there. We were there on our own. This is what we found. This is what happened. The government in Ukraine has to deal with it and make sure it doesn't happen again.
No, I was referring in particular to words of the Russian Foreign Ministry representative Lukashevich, if I'm not mistaken, when he was using evidence and using the reports, quoting the reports of Human Rights Watch and putting it in the context that like Ukrainian punitive forces are doing this, and this is confirmed by Human Rights Watch. And there was even a report on your website when basically like somehow it took the distance from what Russian Foreign Ministry said. So there were some concerns that somehow this like puts more fuel to this fire that Russia is creating around Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Russia has not been promoting the 23 reports that we did about abuses by the separatists. They're not promoting the major report we did about Russia's own abuses in Crimea. They talk about the reports we do about Ukrainian government force abuses. That's not surprising. But we highlight the full body of our work. We make sure that the world doesn't hear only the Russian selective version of Human Rights Watch. They hear the complete picture of what we've done. But of course, if you look at the Ukrainian government, the best way to avoid giving Russia these propaganda opportunities is to stop the misconduct by Ukrainian troops. That requires clear directions, not the vague direction of respect the Geneva Conventions, but rather explicit directions. Never use cluster munitions, never use Grad rockets in populated areas. If President Poroshenko, rather than denying and denying, would send that message, Russia would lose this propaganda opportunity.